Wilson MacLeod, yr Athro Emeritus.
Wilson MacLeod, Emeritus Professor Wilson MacLeod from Edinburgh University. He has written extensively on language policy, in particular on the situation of the Gaelic language in Scotland. He's known Colin for 25 years.
25 years, and the two of you have worked together closely and have presented in many conferences together. Heddiw bydd Wilson yn trafod deddfi ar gyfer yr Eileg yn yr Alban. Today you'll be talking about the legislation process in Scotland currently. So can I give you the floor? Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honour and pleasure to be here. It's been a very stimulating conference so far, and very important to be gathering here in honour of Colin. As Bethan mentioned, I've known Colin quite a while, about 25 years. He's been to Scotland many a time to take part in seminars, conferences, workshops. He's done a lot of research on Scottish language policy himself over the years. So very well kent, as we'd say in Scotland, and very, very highly respected. I've also had the pleasure of just thinking of all the places that I've been to with Colin over the years, and many corners of Europe, and that's been a great pleasure. And I was also very pleased to be involved in editing a festschrift for Colin that came out in 2022. It's called Language, Policy and Territory, which are some of Colin's key contributions. That was co-edited with John Walsh, Catherine Jones and Rob Dunbar. And I see several of the other contributors to that volume are here today. So we're very pleased to have that volume in honour of Colin, which is, of course, hugely deserved. So I want to talk today about language legislation, focusing on Scotland. Of course, language legislation is a topic that Colin has written a great deal about in a comparative context. Some of the countries we've heard about today, obviously here in Wales, he's worked on Ireland, Canada a great deal, and also on Scotland. So I'll be focusing on the Scottish context, but start with a few general ideas which I don't know, maybe count as truisms rather than any great observations, but some things I think are useful in general in relation to language legislation for minority languages specifically. Language legislation should ideally set out clear and specific rights or obligations on the authorities, and ideally in terms that are understandable to the general public. That's to say, language users. They know what they're entitled to, and they know what the authorities should be doing. Ideally, legislation should set effective limits on administrative discretion, that it's not just something that is in the control of the authorities with very little limit on that. And then finally, ideally, there should be clear and effective mechanisms to ensure compliance, that rights are fulfilled and that obligations are delivered. To think about the Scottish language context, the Gaelic language context in Scotland, I think we can add in a few more mechanisms that are perhaps more specifically applicable, but also generally relevant, that legislation should be suitable and relevant to the particular language context, that it's not something you can just transfer from country to country, context to context freely, that it needs to be realistic in terms of deliverability, that specifying obligations or perhaps goals that are not attainable in the medium or long term is not a good idea. And then perhaps most important, that legislation should be useful in terms of its sociolinguistic impact, that it should do something in terms of solidifying, strengthening, reinforcing the actual position of the language and the reality for language users. And I think it's fair to say in the Scottish context that it's fairly questionable whether this has been achieved so far. In a sense, the idea of looking for innovation and good practice in the Gaelic context is a bit of a challenge, as we'll see, partly because in quite a lot of respects, language policy has been somewhat derivative. We can see very much a very strong influence from Wales, on Gaelic language in Scotland in relation to language, to legislation, as well as other things. Also some influence from Ireland, less so than is the case for Wales. But usually these Scottish incarnations or manifestations of Welsh models tend to be in weaker form, one way or another. And that's due to a few reasons. First, the sociolinguistic context is different, as I'll say in a minute, but also more generally because the language is much more marginal in society. There's less political concern, political support for stronger language measures. More specifically, looking at language legislation, the current Language Act in Scotland, dating from 2005, in a lot of respects tracked the then fairly recent Welsh Language Act of 1993, but a weaker version in various ways. Key difference between Gaelic and Welsh is that it's a much smaller language community, around 1/10 as many speakers, and almost 1/20th the density. So only about 1% of the population of Scotland speak Gaelic. So you're talking about a language with a much smaller presence in public life, a much smaller presence in the national identity, national imagination, if you like, and that constrains policy action, legislative action in a lot of respects. So the current act, as I mentioned, goes back to 2005, but a new languages bill was just introduced at the end of last year and is just in the early stages of the parliamentary process. So I want to talk about that and flag up some of the difficulties that it shows in relation to language legislation. As with the earlier act, it draws some inspiration from Welsh policy adjustments since 2005, such as the Welsh language measure of 2011, but at the same time it retains some measures or pro-policies or structures that came to some extent from Wales originally, but have since been superseded in Wales. So it's rejecting some of the changes in Wales, if you like. So most obviously we can see that the Scottish Government is going to take over some functions that were previously assigned to Bors na Gaelic. Bors na Gaelic, the statutory language board, very much along the model of the former Welsh Language Board. So the government taking on certain functions, most obviously to prepare a national Gaelic language strategy, and also it will be in charge of putting out guidance for public bodies' language plans and taking a more direct role in relation to Gaelic education, all functions that had previously been with Bors na Gaelic. The government will have new general duties in relation to promoting the Gaelic language and in terms of promoting Gaelic education. The government is now going to issue standards for public bodies in relation to their Gaelic obligations. Now, the idea of standards came in Wales with the measure of 2011. But although it's the same word, standards, I think it's quite unlikely that these standards, when they emerge in Scotland, will be anywhere near as specific or as stringent as the regulations adopted in Wales. But in principle, it's something that we can say connects back to Welsh language policy. But at the same time, unlike in Wales, where the Welsh Language Board was abolished, Bors na Gaelic is going to be retained in a slightly narrower form, if you like. So it will still be responsible for helping public bodies shape their individual plans, supervising public bodies' language plans, and then continuing to play a role in monitoring language plans. So a sort of a hybrid or mixed role of assisting bodies and then enforcing against them, and that's somewhat an uncomfortable role. And that's a reflection of the fact that the proposal of having a language commissioner has been rejected at this stage. So we have, as discussed in relation to Colin's work, commissioners in a number of jurisdictions, and two commissioners shortly to be created even in Northern Ireland, but Scotland to remain without a commissioner. So this uncomfortable, perhaps, mixture of roles. And then another key element from the bill, no right to Gaelic medium education. This is something that's been a key demand for campaigners really for more than 20 years, and that's not to be part of the new bill, at this new legislation at this stage. Then we have a new element to the bill which is interesting but problematic in various respects, and we'll see what the legislative process throws up. This is a new idea of designating so-called areas of linguistic significance. Now, the political background to this is that there's been increasing concern really for 2 decades and more with the deteriorating language situation in traditional rural communities in the Gaelic area, especially in the islands, and a perceived need for greater support for these traditional communities. But at the same time, a simultaneous awareness of the importance and value of promoting the language nationally, supporting language development, particularly in urban areas. Even more than Wales, Scotland is a very urbanized nation, and supporting new speakers and so on. So this new proposal to have areas of linguistic significance, in a sense, tries to accomplish both these goals. So the idea is that local authorities will be able to designate areas of linguistic significance if that's approved by the central Scottish government. But as we'll see in the next slide, there's a very expansive and malleable definition of what may be eligible for designation as an area of linguistic significance. And perhaps most significantly, it's not at all clear what will be the consequences of designating such an area, what benefits an area or a community will receive, or what obligations will be placed on the authorities, and so on. So the bill describes a process for making designations, but not what might actually come of it. And that's obviously, in terms of policy and sociolinguistic outcomes, that's the key aspect. In a sense, this mechanism is influenced by the Gaeltacht Act of 2012, which John referred to briefly. This idea of setting up different kinds of protected areas, Gaeltacht language planning areas, Gaeltacht service towns, and then Irish language networks. But whereas the Irish legislation does make clear what kind of process will follow, the Scottish bill so far is much less clear about what might be involved. So I said the definition is very broad, and it's broad and problematic in a few respects. So 2 kinds of areas are eligible for designation. One is an area in which 20% or more of the population have Gaelic skills, and that means that they can speak, read, write, or understand the language. It doesn't mean that they actually have to be able to speak it or be active speakers, regular speakers. So 20% or more, and I'll come back to that figure at the end. Or alternatively, if that level of density isn't reached, that it's an area that is historically connected to Gaelic, an area in which Gaelic medium teaching and learning is carried out, or in which there is significant activity relating to Gaelic language and culture taking place. Well, that's a very broad definition and would cover, even though Gaelic is quite marginal in Scotland compared to, say, Welsh and Wales, it would still potentially take in a very large part of the country. And if that were applied in Wales, I would imagine that could be stretched to cover pretty much anywhere in Wales, for example. And then this issue of the 20% threshold, that's a very low figure. For example, it's posited that a figure of 67% is appropriate, because then you have a greater than 50% chance that any 2 people in the community will be minority language speakers. And it's a very rough and ready metric, but obviously 67% is far higher than 20. But even so, with the 20% threshold, only about 1% of the population of Scotland lives in areas even with that level of density. But if you were to try to raise a higher bar, bring it up to 50%, the range of areas covered would drop to a very small level. So it's an indication of how difficult it is to work with a language that is got such small numbers and such low density, even in so-called heartland areas. So really, just to consider where we go from here, what some of the issues are. There's been a view that's developed over time, really, I could say going back to the 90s, but it's certainly been in the last decade and more, it's been clearer and clearer. It's part of the discourse, at any rate, that the idea that Gaelic policy and Gaelic agencies, language professionals, are too bureaucratic and too removed from communities. That's definitely an idea that's out there. But this bill is quite a technical bill, and what it really does is to add several new layers of complexity to the regulatory system. There are all these different kinds of additional regulatory instruments that will be propounded, a new role for local authorities that I mentioned in relation to these areas of linguistic significance. Up to now, local authorities haven't been one of the key players at all. So it's a more complex, more regulated mechanism. A structure, if you like. The bill authorizes the adoption of all these regulatory instruments, so standards, regulations, guidance of different kinds, but it doesn't actually require them. It says they may be adopted. And obviously it gives real little indication of what their actual content would be. So the bill provides all these structures, but it really doesn't give much of a sense of what likely outcomes will be and when it might happen and so on. A range of new obligations on local authorities and other public bodies, but they're stated very generally. And that means that it would be hard to determine whether or not they are being followed. If you say a public body must have regard to this principle, how does a litigant prove that they have not had regard to it? How does that manifest itself in concrete terms? So overwhelmingly, the bill is very much dependent on administrative discretion. The government can decide to do various things. Bors na Gaelic can decide to do various things. Local authorities, other public bodies. But a lot of freedom for them, coupled with the fact that there really isn't anything in the way of external oversight and no clear mechanisms for the language community to make its voice heard. As I mentioned, that there wouldn't be a commissioner and so on. So I think there's quite a lot of questions. As I mentioned, this bill is very new. The very early stages of the parliamentary process are just going on, and that will be obviously an opportunity to amend the bill, but also will be a very useful opportunity for a wider assessment of language policy. I've spoken just about Gaelic here today. I should say this bill also addresses the Scots language for the first time. Much less about Scots in the bill than for Gaelic. But there should be quite a wide-ranging investigation and debate, hopefully, about language policy in Scotland, and that will be, let's say, historic. Anyway, thank you very much for taking the time today, and as I say, it's been a great honour to be here for Colin today. Thank you. Diolch. Thank you.